Welcome, everyone, to our hot topics for May 5th from the League of Women Voters in Nashville. Today, we're going to have a couple of folk talking to us about the history and the future of Fort Negley. Fort Negley, if you don't know, is a park here in Nashville. It's near where the complex of the Science Center and Fort Negley over, I guess, between 2 or 3, I'm not sure how many interstates, but specifically and very importantly, Fort Negley in 2019 was designated a site of memory on the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO's Slave Route Project. Today, Dr. Angela Sutton and Cyril Stewart will be describing both the history and the future plans for Fort Negley. Dr. Sutton is a research assistant professor at Vanderbilt in the Communication and Science and Technology Department. She's a social and digital historian of the Atlantic world and particularly interested in the tools and methods that preserve and widen access to the sources that help refine and define popular understandings of American slavery and its consequences currently. She is the director of the Fort Negley Descendants Project, which is an oral history archive of the descendants of the enslaved folk who built and defended Fort Negley during the Civil War. Her work is at the intersection between slavery, memory, and the digital. It has appeared in the Historical Journal, the Afro-Hispanic Review, Archipelagos, Slavery and Abolition, and the Journal of Slavery and Data Preservation. Her most recent project is the development of a database of over 18,500 enslaved and free Black builders and defenders of Nashville's Civil War fortifications throughout the use of community-driven data, and is being funded by the National Endowment of the Humanities and the National Park Service. Cyril Stewart is a practicing architect in Middle Tennessee and has been for a few years. Cyril Stewart has a wide variety of experience in office, healthcare, hospitality, historic architecture, and urban planning. He specializes in historic preservation, adaptive reuse, and designing facilities that fit into the community context. His work is in urban and community planning and visioning serves as a foundation for all that he does. In his 25 years at Vanderbilt Medical Center, the facilities expanded considerably by 10 million square feet. He's a builder. As director of planning, he led hundreds of projects, including a master plan for the 21st Avenue Historic and Central Campus, project leader and master planner for the 100 Oaks campus, and led community engagement activities. He is the vice chair of the Metro Nashville Historic Zoning Commission. When the bomb blast occurred on Christmas Day, he was appointed to chair the Historic Commission for the 2nd Avenue Rebuilding Task Force by the Historic Commission and Mayor. His largest current project is the transformation of the O'Moore campus in Franklin, Tennessee, of the Franklin Grove Estate and Gardens. He has many, many, many other projects that he's been involved in, and specifically today he will help us understand both the past and the future and what they'll be involved with at Fort Negley. So Dr. Sutton and Mr. Stewart, I look forward to your presentation today.
Great. Thank you so much. That was just such a lovely introduction. And I'm just so grateful to be able to speak as well with Cyril Stewart, because I think historians and planners kind of go together like peanut butter and jelly. And it's really nice when we can take past lessons and apply them so that we can live better tomorrows. All right, so I'm going to tell you quickly, well, as quickly as I can. I'm a historian, so, but as quickly as I can about the history of Fort Negley, how it got that big fat UNESCO designation, and why it's so important to support this planning process. So let's start from the beginning, from the beginning of the fort when Fort Negley was being built, right? So Fort Negley was an incredibly important strategic place to Nashville because it was sort of like, it's in the south of Nashville, right? South of the capital, so it protects the capital. And it faces southward because they're expecting attack coming in from the south, right? But it took 4,933 people to build this fort. And the vast majority of them were enslaved people. So it was a mixed population. So some were enslaved. And as you can see from that picture there, or that drawing at the bottom, sometimes the Union men would come in and raid plantations and other sites of enslavement and force people to work. But other times, refugees from the war ran to Fort Negley because they knew that they could be safe behind Union lines, and then they volunteered their labor in order to help build. We also had a population of free Black tradespeople that lived here in Nashville by the river, and a lot of them came voluntarily to Fort Negley in exchange for a wage in order to help build the fort. So there was a lot. And what's so interesting, I think, about Fort Negley specifically in Nashville is that, white Nashville was split 50-50 during the Civil War. And I think that really tells you all you need to know about why this space is so contentious, right? So building the fort. We know that during the construction of the fort, they really worked in incredibly horrific conditions, as you can see here from the quote from the chief engineer who helped to design Fort Negley. And around 800 people died because of exposure, malnourishment, and of course, a terrible cholera and dysentery epidemic that swept through a population that was already kind of really vulnerable because they're working so hard. I also wanted to mention that Fort Negley was incredibly important because Southern enslavers would send slave catchers to try to pull refugees back and force them to continue to work. And so it was really, while for some people, Fort Negley was like this space of oppressiveness where they were forced into building and they were sometimes forced to death. For other people, it was a site of freedom and a site of hope, and a place that they voluntarily ran to in order to hide from re-enslavers and the slave catching patrols that would come here. And I love this quote from Joseph Fowley because he kind of encapsulates that. He was interviewed by Ophelia Settle Egypt, who was a professor at Fisk during Reconstruction. And that is still in the Fisk Special Collections. That's where I got it from. So once Fort Negley was finished, it was the largest inland fort constructed in the US. It's a porcupine or star-shaped limestone structure. There's only 2 in the entire country. There's 3 levels of defense, and it's an intimidation tactic, right? When you think about like this fort, like there was never any fighting at the fort directly because it was unthinkable to even attack that fort. So by putting that fort where they put it, they essentially forced the Confederate militaries to make other decisions to attack Nashville, and those decisions would ultimately prove fatal, right? Let's see, we also hear the term contraband camp a lot, and I just wanted to reiterate, that was the legal term for a person who was enslaved, who self-emancipated, so who ran away, and who came to stay at Fort Negley in camps and offered to work alongside the other people who were working there. So we use the term refugee now, but contraband was the legal term that was used at that time. So the United States Colored Troops played a huge role in the history of Fort Negley too, because there were 13,000 Black soldiers who fought in the Battle of Nashville. So this was the Civil War conflict that had the largest number of Black combatants. Here in the picture, you can see Mr. Gary Burke, which I bet at least half of you watching know who this is because he is somewhat of a celebrity here in Nashville. So he is the descendant of Private Peter Bailey, who was in Company K and who was stationed at Fort Negley after the war during Reconstruction. Let's see, so the Battle of Nashville happened in December of 1864, and the Battle of Nashville really shattered the Confederate Army of the Tennessee and marked the end of major Confederate offenses in the Western Theater during the Civil War. So it effectively ended because it forced Hood's army to move to less favorable fighting places, and it destroyed it as an effective fighting force. Nevertheless, we saw about 3,000 Union casualties from the war. Confederates lost about 6,000 in this battle. Then after the war, you have a lot of the people who fought. So a lot of the Black veterans who fought at Fort Negley, they settle in these neighborhoods that are surrounding the fort. So if you think about the history of Fort Negley, you think about where stuff is, right? You have the Edge Hill neighborhood, historically Black. You have Napier, which is just down the street, historically Black. You have Cameron Trimble, which is also historically Black, but that one is the most heavily gentrified neighborhood. So the population is rapidly shifted there. But because all of these formerly emancipated, formerly enslaved Black people had settled in these communities, it was a place where the KKK liked to gravitate towards, because Fort Negley was a sign of Black emancipation, right? Black people had come there, they built it, they fought there, or they fought for it. And so the KKK really wanted to reclaim that during and after Reconstruction. And so in April of 1867, a call went out for all known Ku Klux Klan chapters or dens to send representatives to Nashville for a meeting that would plan the Klan response to the new federal Reconstruction policy. And they met right here at the Maxwell House Hotel, which used to be on Church and Fourth. Now it's up here in North Nashville. Race riots were mobs led by the Klan, sometimes in robes, most of the time not bothering to hide. They went through Fort Negley and they rode their horses up to the top of that hill. Nashville also had several lynchings at that time. At Fort Negley's neighborhoods, there was a woman who lived on the Bass Street side, which was right by where the Science Center is. She lived in one of those homes. Her partner, her boyfriend, they were not married. The newspaper made a big deal about that. Her partner, Leander Woods, he wanted to do something about the Klan terrorizing her and all of her neighbors. And so he ended up creating a defense force of Black veterans from the Civil War, and they engaged the Klan in armed conflict at Fort Negley. And they did such a good job that for the next 20 years, I haven't seen any mention of the Klan at Fort Negley in any of the newspapers. So then in the 1920s and 30s, they start to kind of try to figure out, like, what should we do? So there was talk about turning it into a national military park, but ultimately that honor. In the 1930s, the Parks Commissioners proposed to purchase St. Cloud Hill property for the purpose of constructing a public park, and the board intended to incorporate the Negley site into its recreational cityscape. So, but as late as 1931, there were still squatters living at that hill, which you can see from this quote here at the Parks Board meeting. So in this era, you kind of have the Great Depression. It comes in the South. White people are taking jobs that were only formerly for Black Southerners. So Black Southerners are making do with almost nothing at this time because things are just so tight. So there's homeless camps everywhere on the riverbank and on St. Cloud Hill, and it's a really grim time. And then we hit the late 1930s. So in order to recover from that, we have the Works Progress Administration, right? And so the Works Progress Administration came in, decided to help clean up Fort Negley. It was a really amazing feat of engineering. So if you're interested in like cityscaping, engineering, things like that, it's really worth looking into. They had 2,500 perch of stone were requarried, along with 18,000 cubic yards of dirt. And then they used in what was intended as a modified rebuild of the original. And then as part of the project, the WPA also designed and constructed those entrance stone pylons that you see that everyone likes to like take their pictures with. So those are not original, those come in the 1930s. They also introduced some drainage culverts, some stone stairways, gravel paths, stone edging, stuff like that. So most of what you see now is dated from the WPA. We also have in 1938, the park, Fort Negley becomes a park for whites, and the Black people who live nearby have to go over to Edge Hill, Rose Park in Edge Hill, which is still there because that was the site of Fort Morton, which was Fort Negley's sister site. And that's where Black people played baseball and white people played here at Fort Negley. Sorry. Okay. And then in the 1950s, we have the park becoming dilapidated again because those funds from the Works Progress Administration run out and things kind of get run down. The city doesn't have or doesn't want to allocate funds to maintain it. So they're rerouted. Only the ball fields are used at Fort Negley, but the fort itself becomes a place where truants, police interrogations, squatting, etc. happen. There's a small, bizarre kind of instance in the newspapers that I found where well, sorry, I didn't find it. Krista Castillo, the former curator, found this. We thought this was fascinating, where this really wealthy woman in Nashville wanted to create a zoo there. So she bought a bunch of money, but it ended up not working. So she had to find a place to put those animals. In the early 1950s, the Ku Klux Klan does return now. So this is after the Leander Woods era. So the KKK returns, they burn crosses on at least 2 occasions on that hill. The local KKK chapter takes no responsibility, and a brief police investigation located no suspects. One local resident believed that the burnings were directed at her after she refused to sign a neighborhood petition requesting that she refused to sell her property to African Americans. And then that brings us into urban renewal and the highways. Right. So during this time, there was a concerted push to create the highway system. And generally what would happen is that lower income neighborhoods, which mostly belong to African Americans or other minorities, were targeted as the places for these things. So highways were a tool sort of for justifying the destruction in many of these areas. This combines with the American Housing Act of 1949, which oversees a sweeping expansion of the federal role in mortgage insurance and issuance. and the construction of public housing. So they started to make slum clearance a priority. Between 1953 and 1986, the federal government spends $13.5 billion on urban redevelopment. So of course, Nashville gets a slice of that money. But I say this because I want to really emphasize that this is not just like a thing that happens in Nashville. This is a pattern across the entire country. This is a national federal level project. Nashville's just getting some of that money, right? So in the case of Nashville, both highways 40 and 65 were part of the Edge Hill Urban Redevelopment Plan, and they bisected the Edge Hill neighborhood, and they completely destroyed the Bass Street community. So the Bass Street community is here. You can see it on this map. So it's really literally right where the Adventure Science Center is, plus all that area where the highway now is. That all used to be a Black neighborhood. In 2019, professors at MTSU began excavating on the Bass Street side of Fort Negley over by the Science Center, because after the war, many of those builders and defenders had nowhere to return to, right? Like they're not going to return to their sites of enslavement or a plantation unless they absolutely have to. And so a lot of them cut 2021, we had a joint dig. It was Vanderbilt and MTSU together. I brought some descendants over. We reached out to, oh, why are you, no, not yet. So I brought some descendants over. We reached out to people who had originally lived in that Bass Street community. In that middle picture there with the brick, you can see that's Miss Janine Blackman. She is the CEO of the African American Cultural Alliance, and Mr. Philip Minter. Both of them grew up in the Bass Street community when they were children, and they're looking at a brick that was used in the construction of the Bass Street church that archaeologists had found just laying right out there on the surface. It's all surface level stuff. And that brick still had the fingerprints of the people who had built it. And these were people who were formerly enslaved, who built Fort Negley, and then who defended it in the Battle of Nashville and settled in that community. So it's like there's a really strong like generational pull from that history into the present that I think a lot of people in Nashville maybe didn't know about or hadn't appreciated properly. So it's really exciting now to be able to collect everyone's thoughts and everyone's remembrances of that time, because we just don't have enough documents to have the full understanding of this history. Something else I wanted to show you is that on the right-hand side, there is my research assistant, Jessica Fletcher. She's holding the census from 1900. And in this census, it lists the plot of land that these students are digging at as the home of railroad laborers H. and Annie Tobias. And their son Luther is listed as at school. So already we see the beginnings of these like early Black free communities in Nashville and the value they're placing on the education of their children. So in 2007, we get a renewal plan in earnest, which is amazing. This story is well documented because it's a little bit more recent. Basically, a lot of descendants and the Cultural Alliance fought really hard for this. Thelma Harper is in that picture at the top in the red. She was a state senator. Rest in peace. We lost her quite recently. She's flanked by people from the Battle of Nashville Preservation Society, and she helped to get this opened along with Nashville's mayor at the time, Bill Purcell. By then, people started to know the history because of Bobby Lovett and Leorotha Williams, two professors at TSU who started making this history available to the city. So really wanted to make sure that we say their names and we celebrate them as people who began what is a long time excavation of this really important history. All right, 10 years later, though, in 2017, the mayor of Nashville sells half of Fort Negley Park for condos. This was one of the worst moments of Nashville's like recent life, I think. And we've had a couple, right? We've had quite a lot. But the whole historical preservation community in Middle Tennessee just riots, right? And I was part of that. And there was a Parks Board meeting that happened where we were able to voice our concerns, and that was where I got involved with the work at Fort Negley. So I spoke at the meeting. Like I like to joke, my spirit left my body. I don't remember what I said, but I was incredibly angry. I remember that. But afterward, two gentlemen in the blue uniform came up to me and they're like, hey, we could use your anger. And so we began to talk about how we could start to save the fort. And that is the origin of the Fort Negley Descendants Project. So these two gentlemen were Gary Burke and Bill Radcliffe. They're both descendants of Union soldiers who fought in the Civil War. And they both have been working as living historians with the uniform, sharing the history with anyone that would engage with them when they go to the fort or other places in the city. And so together we found other descendants who wanted to tell their stories. I've been interviewing people. What does Fort Negley do? Basically, we find as many descendants as want to share their story, interview them. The ones who want to go online, we paste online. The ones who don't, I just keep the data so that we can pull from it when we're doing all other kinds of work. We've been finding, we kind of verify some of the things that they share with us in terms of dates and in terms of where their relatives are buried and deeds and any other information that they've saved in their families. And that brings us to historical designations. So a lot of people agree that we need to save Fort Negley Park and that it deserves to be something more special than it currently is, right? It deserves to be treated with the specialness that it has. So it's on the National Register. We also put it on the UNESCO slave route. And very recently, it earned a designation on the National Park Service Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. The thing I know the most about is UNESCO because I was the one who helped kind of make that happen. I was on the team of people working to give that designation to Fort Negley. The reason why this is so important, it's called the Slave Route Project. They've changed the name to the Route of Enslaved Peoples just because that it makes a little bit more sense. But it's a UNESCO initiative that was officially launched in 1994 in Ouida in Benin. So it's rooted in the mandate of the organization, which believes that ignorance or concealment of major historical events constitutes an obstacle to mutual understanding, reconciliation, and cooperation among peoples. The project breaks the silence surrounding the slave trade and slavery that has affected all continents and caused great upheavals that have shaped our modern societies. They believe that in studying the causes and the consequences of slavery and the slave trade, that we can enhance the understanding of diverse histories and heritages that stem from this global tragedy for the betterment of everybody, really, right? Because slavery isn't just Black history, it's all of our history. Especially here in Nashville, it's very rare that you find slavery without white people. So it's really important that together we all claim this history together and that we together find a way to move forward from it. Here's what the nomination form looked like. Just want to show you the sponsors because at the time that we nominated this site, it exceeded all the criteria necessary for a site like this, which let me tell you, not a lot of sites do. But the city was unwilling to sponsor because the city wanted this land sold. They wanted the memory forgotten at the time. The city has changed its tune, of course, because it's never just one person that gets to make a decision. It's a collective decision. I think collectively we're understanding the importance of this space. But notice the sponsors had to get special permission from UNESCO to allow the Friends of Fort Negley and the Nashville NAACP to be the sponsors because the city wouldn't sponsor it. I think now, of course, the city absolutely would. So it just goes to show you that these things are very much a collective decision, and it really takes well, it takes a village, right? It takes everybody's input. It takes people paying attention. It takes people saying things, sharing their opinions, and making noise when something important gets threatened. So the last thing I just wanted to share is that while I've collected those oral histories through the Fort Negley Descendants Project, I began to work on the Builders and Defenders database to make searchable the biographical information about those 4,933 enslaved and free Black builders, as well as the 13,000 Black soldiers from the 8 regiments who defended Fort Negley in the Battle of Nashville. We also added in some other local Black people that had a Civil War legacy, so that makes for a total of about 18,500 people, all of whom were Black, who had something to do with Fort Negley and its construction and its protection. So I just want you to think, like, most of this population remained in Central Tennessee after the war. So after 7 generations, how many people are there from a total of 18,500? That's really what we're looking at in terms of who has a connection to this site. So I think that now that we're sort of making all of this information public and taking the time to go through the archives and putting it out there for people to use, more and more people are finding that they too have a connection to this space. And they're realizing the specialness of this space. So this coincides with the new master plan, which will give us an overhaul of the site. So now I'm going to pass you over to architect and president of the Friends of Fort Negley, Cyril Stewart, who can talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
I'll need to get permission to share screen. You could do that.
Laura,
It says host.
Yeah.
Yeah, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. So
I just enabled it. It should be ready for you.
okay, here we go. That's great. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you being with us today and being part of this program. It's it's an exciting project. I'm really excited about what's going on here, and I think you're going to enjoy seeing what we have coming up. Okay. So what I want to talk about is the past, present, future. Some of this will overlap with what Angela has described, but I think they can coordinate really well. So if you look at it, Nashville falls to the Union, and St. Cloud was selected as a major fortification there, and that becomes the largest inland fort in the nation. It's really an impressive fort. You can see that when you go there, especially if you compare it with other forts that you go to. Between 34 and 35, as Angela said, the Works Progress Administration reconstructed Fort Negley. They quarried stone from the hillside. They reused some of the existing stones, and then they built a museum at a former magazine. So that was a lot that was done, and you can see a lot of that's what you see mostly when you go to the site today. And then when you go to 1936 to 1941, they led an effort to build a 50-acre park with battlefields, ball fields, and bleacher seating. And it was right adjacent to the fort. You can still see the remnants of those stone ball fields that they put in place. And the parks were segregated. A playground for African-American children was also built. And then baseball fields actually existed here from at or before 1941 until 2015. But for a lot of us that grew up here in Nashville, you probably remember that there wasn't a lot to be seen with Fort Negley. It was overgrown. World War II sort of took all the emphasis of building a special park here and took the emphasis away from that. And it was, in essence, forgotten for the most part, except for the ball fields, until recently. The mid-1990s initiative by Phil Bredesen led to the Fort Negley Master Plan of 1996. And then Bill Purcell took it even further with another master plan in 2002, and that was supplemented in 2007. And then the recent unpleasantness, if you grew up in the South, you've probably heard some of our ancestors refer to the recent unpleasantness described about the Civil War. But our recent unpleasantness at Fort Negley was really when Cloud Hill was planned as a full commercial development with artist, music space, housing, retail, park space. As Angela said, it was very controversial. Discussions for that started in 2015, actually before the Sound Stadium moved, and ended in January of 2018. There was a good deal of opposition and the likely presence of unmarked graves on the site. So groups really focused on saving the site then and creating a master plan for a 65-acre park. That master plan was completed in October of 22. And the good news is in 2023, Mayor John Cooper, who has been a strong proponent of this park and of preservation, put it into his capital spending budget, and the council approved incorporation of phase 1. And so we are now moving toward implementation of phase 1 with about $17 million devoted to that. So the master plan, as I said, was completed in October of 22. We had 5 community meetings that were well attended, 14 stakeholder meetings, and more than 175 participants and almost 1,200 comments that were incorporated into this plan. So it really is a community-oriented plan. And this is the vision, an open air museum, national significance that really talks about history from the Civil War to civil rights. But one of the things that I like to talk to people about is one of our favorite programs now that kids love coming to is the fossil program. So in essence, our history goes back to 450 million years ago when those fossils were created, and then all the way up to actually the incorporation of the interstate and the civil rights movement. This is an aerial view looking down at it. You can see the fort right in the middle there. The gulch is right above that. You can see how isolated this is, but in reality, we have a number of parks around it. You've got the downtowns adjacent to it, Wedgwood, Houston, but the railroad track shown in yellow and the interstate shown in black really have isolated this site for a number of years. So one of the things that the master plan has looked at is how we might go in and reconnect to those neighborhoods. This is another aerial view. It shows the adjacency of the city cemetery right across the railroad tracks from this, and the visitor center down at the bottom. Adventure Science Center, of course, is at the north end of the site there. This is a view of the fort itself. It shows the fortifications and what kind of condition they're in. They have actually been improved. You can see work underway here to restore some of the stonework, and that work is continuing. This shows the master plan and the overview of the master plan. To the top of the slide is the parking lot and then the Adventure Science Center. And to the bottom is the visitor center and a new parking area that would be located not where the sound stadium was, but located right in front of the visitor center, right off Chestnut Street. It would retain the existing WPA monument entrance as a pedestrian entrance there. As you can see from this, there are a lot of hiking trails, a lot of walking trails. It is lightly touching the site, so we're not looking at a lot of major improvements or excavation on the site to respect the archaeology and the history of the site. We'll be showing you some of the elements, but to the lower right-hand side where the old sound stadium was and the ball field was, will be a plaza and memorial lawn. That plaza will be a major lawn for community events and for other gatherings, and it will be a key part of the site. The fort itself is, of course, on top of the hill. The Central Plaza is part of a walking trail that allows interpretation at various areas. The Bass Street Plaza celebrates the Bass Street neighborhood, and then there's Interpretive Center and Entry Plaza that we'll be having as well. So the visitor center that we have is anticipated to be expanded. This is shows a lot more detail of what's on the site. The prior slide just showed the overview. As you can see, we have a lot of areas for interpretation. One of the things that we're doing is taking this site back to native grasses and really doing it as much more of a green site, a natural area that was much more like it would have been at one point in time. It was cleared completely during the Civil War of trees to protect the vistas as well as from a military standpoint. And so what you see now with few trees on the site is the way that it would have been, and that's what we intend to keep as we move into the master plan. And by the way, if you have questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat, and Angela and I will get to those as we finish up this. This shows the new parking area that will be located right off Chestnut Street in front of the existing visitor center, which is shown as number 4. And to the right, where number 5 is, will be the Great Lawn, and then the entrance to the fort and interpretive area is number 2. This shows an expanded interpretive center. If you've been to the existing interpretive center, visitor center, you know that there's no view of the fort from there. It turns its back to the fort. This new visitor center expansion of it will actually have glass that looks up to the fort so that you can see a lot of what's going on up in that area. And you can see established lawns where the existing parking is, and recreation of the amphitheater seating and WPA grandstands with the remnants of that are remaining. This is a view that shows the amazing location of this park, so close to the downtown, and shows such a green space. To have 65 acres this close to downtown and this much population, this many visitors, is a real gem for the city. And so this shows the Great Lawn, the Memorial Lawn in the foreground with a Chestnut Street Plaza down at the bottom of the screen. And then it shows the meadow trails and other interpretive center and the fort at the top of the hill. This is a different view. It's looking as if you can see the Adventure Science Center is to the right. So we're looking to the southwest, and this shows interpretive nodes, native grasslands, mowed paths. And so it'll be a variety of pathways and experiences for people If you go there today, you see people walking this area all the time. And as the population continues to explode in that area, we expect more and more people that will be using this park for those passive uses. To the right, on the bottom right of the screen, you'll see the Bass Street Plaza. Now, we haven't fully designed all these. These are placeholders. The interpretation, media, and how we do that is still yet to be determined. We hope phase one will be able to get the park open, and then we'll move into subsequent phases and fundraising to be able to have things that focus on the Bass Street area that help people to envision what that is and what that was and the significance of it. The same thing with Memorial Lawn and other areas. This is a view, again, the Adventure Science Center is at the top of the screen. This shows the fort, and it shows additional development of the fort itself and stabilized and repaired stonework and areas for overlooks and more interpretation of what that fort was. This shows areas that we have in different areas throughout the park that will be, in essence, thresholds or gateways and areas where you can see and interpret and learn more about what was on this site and what the significance of it is. This is another example of an interpretive area that can show some interpretive panels and other ways of being able to visualize what was here before. Connections are really important, and this slide shows the connections we want to be able to establish through this master plan, connections to the City Central Greenway, to the Edge Hill community, to Browns Creek Greenway that is in planning, and then to certainly the Wedgwood Houston area, as well as the Nashville City Cemetery. Being able to connect to this will help to unify these neighborhoods and make it a park that's accessible to everyone, and not just those who drive there. And this again shows the Memorial Lawn and shows the view of the city in the distance. You can see here just to the right of the city, the screen, shade structures with interpretive panels. You know, those are yet to be designed, but will be areas where people can really learn more about baseball, learn more about the use of this site over the years, and what it means to the future. And at this point, I'll go ahead and open it up to discussion, and we can talk about any questions that you might have.
You know, Angela and Cyril, I would be happy to field the questions, or if you all want to look at the chat and go ahead and respond, that's also possible. So
Karen would be glad for you to field the questions. That'd be good.
Oh, well, then I will do that. Many of them are, of course, mine, because I am kind of person. So the question about the connections that you brought up, I had asked about greenways and pathways to the various things, and you answered that. But one of them that has come up is WeGo also incorporating it into their routing system.
I'm not aware of that at this point in time. I'm not aware that WeGo is incorporating that. Hopefully in the future they will. I mean, it could be a destination. So Angela, you know anything about that? Do you have any knowledge about it? I'm not aware of anything so far.
Well, that's something that we should certainly follow up with the WeGo people about, I think. So one of the things, one question was asked, one of the things that I wanted to point out is that on Saturday, there will be a lecture at, I believe, 1 o'clock at Fort Negley that you can either go in person or Zoom. And I placed it into the chat, and it's about the Builders and Defenders database and an artist who's involved in visualizing that. So there's also a link there so that if you want to, you can find out more information about that. That's this Saturday. And the master plan, one question was about whether the master plan is going to include programming for a walking tour. And it would seem that Angela answered that. So Angela, would you like to answer that, not just in fingers, but in
Yeah, yeah, sure. So as far as I know, I speak with Richie at Hodgson Douglas Landscape Architecture quite regularly, and we've been sort of like discussing like how this will look. And he said that with the master plan, they really wanted to like be concerned with the landscape and creating a landscape that was incredibly diverse in terms of how it could be used. So creating ways in which we could create walking tours in the future, also creating like places like outdoor classrooms and stuff like that, so that it lends itself to the most robust amount of programming that we can have, with the idea that hopefully people like the Friends of Fort Negley and others will step up and create some of that programming. And we already are. At the Friends of Fort Negley meeting, we've already started to talk about the different types of tours that we can offer already, and in the future what that could look like as well. And we're hoping that other community groups will want to step up and start doing some of that as well. We'll also welcome anyone who wants to help fundraise or write grants to help us create more robust programming once we have the space to do it.
And Berkeley, that's a great question too about the walking tours. We're actually not waiting for the master plan implementation for that. We'll be starting those tours in the next few months. We have people like Angela and others on the board that are resident experts. Gary Burke is one that already is doing tours that are more of an informal nature, but we want to go ahead and schedule those tours that are adjacent to but not overlapping with the city cemetery tours. So we'll be announcing those in the near future to be able to have those kind of tours starting this summer.
Wonderful. We have a question from someone who's based in Knoxville who wants a little more background on how the tide was turned, Angela, with respect to, making it into an quote economic unquote development project versus a piece of the history project. Can you give a little more to that?
Yeah, it's such a great question. Thank you, Hope. And it's also something that I think is really useful for us as people who are deeply concerned with our city and who want to make those interventions kind of think about, right? Because this is a fight that no one person could have won, no one organization could have won it. Quite frankly, there was a lot of money roped into it. When you think about this gentrifying city and how expensive land is now, like Fort Negley is 2 miles from downtown. Can you imagine how many millions that land was worth? And so it's constantly going to be under threat unless people step up and say, no, this is part of our heritage, we're not letting it go. And I think it took so there were multiple historical preservation organizations, there were multiple there were multiple academics who were involved. There were landscape architects, there were city planners, there were politicians, there were musicians, right? Kix Brooks from Brooks and Dunn stepped up. So you get you get the most unusual allies will kind of step out of the woodwork. And something that I really wanted to emphasize too, that I thought was really beautiful and something that maybe people from outside of Nashville might not have known about, was that our descendants, many of our descendants who do historical living reenactment, they wear the uniforms and they go out and they do the battles, or they help to teach history while being the character that, or while acting as the character or as their ancestor. They do a lot of historical reenactment with Confederate reenactors as well. They work together, which is something that I think people from outside of Nashville, really surprises them. But a lot of those Confederate reenactors also stepped in to help try to save Fort Negley, because Civil War history is Civil War history. Black people's Civil War history is just as important as every other piece of Civil War history, and isn't just Black history, it's all of our history together. So having these unlikely allies from across every spectrum, right? We had the Republican ladies brunch, they came in and they helped too. So it was like a mass effort. And I think that I know that not everybody is willing to work together, not everyone is willing to have goodwill and good faith, I get that. But I think as long as goodwill and good faith can be maintained, we should all be trying to push for the same things that we agree on. And I think one of the most important things we can agree on is that some things are worth saving and are worth having, and you cannot put a price on that. And it was really wonderful to see people in Nashville come together and agree to that.
So one question also has to do with the metro and our park system and incorporating Fort Negley and the expansion of Fort Negley into that, and concerns about ongoing funding for maintenance and upkeep.
So, Corinne, that's a great question, and one that we've been focused on a lot with Friends of Fort Negley. And as you mentioned in your note, and as most of us know, Parks does a great job at envisioning new parks, at designing new parks, at really coming up with things like this master plan that they led the effort for. However, they're limited in terms of being able to maintain and program. And they've been doing a good job at maintaining Fort Negley, actually Fort Negley is different than most parks because we are very concerned about disturbing any artifacts within the soil. And so right now I was out there yesterday, they were working on removal of invasives, but unlike most places where you go in and pull them up by the roots, we can't do that at Fort Negley. So we have other techniques. We also have one of the fun things to see out there is the chew crew. It's the sheep that come out and work to keep the weeds and the grass down. So that's another way that we do that. But one of the things that we want to do with our Friends of Fort Negley group is to elevate this board and really make it one that can really step in, and where there are additional maintenance needs, and especially where there are additional programming needs, to be able to come up and sponsor those as Friends of Fort Negley. We have some programming now from the park. Tracy does a great job with that, but we want to be able to step that up, and we see the Friends group as one that does that. So we'll be stepping up our fundraising and other efforts to be able to bring in more resources for programming and that kind of thing. And we're not going to wait until the completion of the master plan to start those efforts.
Cyril, is a Friends group capable or able in Tennessee to put together an endowment?
I would think so. There are probably others on this call that are more familiar with that. But if you look at things like what the Centennial Park Conservancy and the Friends of Warner Parks have done, I mean, they have massive impact on the parks that they support and sponsor. So,
yeah. Well, one of the things that I think is super important about this park the others are very important as well, but there are so few parks in the downtown area, and green space down there is so minimal that I think integrating it more into particularly as downtown does what seems to be its thing that it's doing. More ways of using that as the green space that folk can use. And asking specifically, one of the other questions I had was, what is the expectation about in connecting and integrating the Science Center with Fort Negley?
As many of you probably know, the Science Center just has a new executive director, CEO that's been hired. We're excited about meeting that person and starting the conversations. We're scheduled to do that starting next month. So look forward to those conversations. Now we might work together.
As an aside, I think I mentioned before you came on, Cyril, that my husband was involved at Peabody for a long time. He's emeritus now. And many of the students there and many of the programs there, particularly in a program called Learning and Design, get involved with the Science Center and the idea of incorporating the history, and in particular African-American history in Nashville with the Science Center would be something that it seems to me there might be some students that would be.
That's right.
Angela's just across the street, and I'm sure she could
That's right.
do that, etc. We have
Good.
one other. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Oh
no, go ahead.
Okay, we have one other question. It would seem, and I had not known this, but there was a long-standing unhoused encampment at the area, and I understand that it was not a particular in some of the more poorly designed and executed things. I understand that was something that was problematic. Do you have any plans to make something known about that encampment?
Yeah, so that's a wonderful question. I think that it's so important because, you know, historically, Fort Negley has always been a site of refuge for people who had nowhere else to go. And I think that when you think about what that means for our city, it makes the unhoused population there incredibly important, because there were times when the city has pushed them out or relocated them. And I think these are ongoing conversations that all cities need to have. I also think that when we have the bigger center, we'll be able to create much more historical information and many more exhibits that people can interact with. And I hope if I have anything to do with it, this will happen. We will have an exhibit about the unhoused population because they also have left their footprint on the site, right? And you know, a lot of them also brought in artifacts that they found when they were living in the area that were from the Reconstruction era or from the Bass Street community, which of course they didn't have to do, but many of them brought them in because they see the intrinsic value of the place on which they're living. So it is also their home, right? Like, so I think it's really important that we are very careful and intentional about the way we talk about that. And thank you for asking that question, because I think it's so important to have those discussions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's actually amazing. And it's one of those things that I guess, and I apologize, I had to be nudged into knowing about this. And so I think it might be a thing to add to your presentation. So I was going to ask another question, but it just flew the coop, like so many things are now doing in my age.
Believe me, we understand that. And I noticed Berkeley had a comment that cell phones are a great way to create content. And we have recently hired a young woman, Destiny Hanks, to really work with us on our social media, on our website, and really to work with member databases and that kind of thing. So having her on board now and engaged in that brings a level of expertise and knowledge that I certainly don't have. And we're looking forward to she's already made some real progress, and we're looking forward to things. And we'll definitely be working on the cell phone ways to really expand the story and expand being able to tell the story. You know, one of the things I think about historic sites is that, and you know, I love historic markers, and I typically am, you know, I'll bore my family by stopping to read historic markers and things like that. But the thing that happens is when you have a place that is the place where it happened, you know, and the Hamilton, it's the room where it happened. There is nothing like standing on this fort and hearing about and learning about the stories. And it's so easy to visualize because of what's there now and what will be there in the future of what happened. There's no place like being where it happened to be able to understand what our history is and how that affects, you know, our forward movement and our decisions today and how to move into a stronger, better nation than what we currently have.
Excellent. Are there any other questions that anyone has from the floor that they don't have to type, but they'd like to ask?
While you're asking, we're thinking about, can I add one thing that I wanted to say, which is that I think often when we talk about Fort Negley, it is very much a history project, right? It's very much like a historical site. But in addition to that, it's also a site that sort of helps us decide who we want to be and how we want the world to see us as a city. And I think that sometimes gets forgotten. And I think that the ways in which that we have cared for Fort Negley and put it kind of at the center of our thoughts, the way the city has just allocated $17.5 million toward this master plan, the ways in which everyone continues to advocate, continue to ask for information about Fort Negley, really shows that Nashville is interested in becoming something incredibly beautiful. And I'm so excited to be here at this time. I'm so excited to be able to help with that, to push the descendants' voices to the front and make sure that people can really get to learn what we're all about, because it's not downtown, it's not bachelorette parties, right? It's this, we're about this.
Thank you so much, Angela. If there are no other questions, I will say a few things. There is a question about where can you find this recording? And after a few days to a week, it will be processed and will be available on the Legal Women Voters Nashville's website. And all of our hot topics, are there and available, so that I can basically check back there. If you send me a direct message, email, I can respond if you want when it comes up. I try to remember. And then I'm also going to ask Melissa to tell us about the hot topic for June.
Yes, June. Thank you, Karen. So June, as many of you may be aware, is internationally recognized as Pride Month, which is a celebration and commemoration of the LGBTQIA plus communities. And we will have Joseph Woodson, who is the advocacy chair for the Tennessee Pride Chamber. It is the LGBT Chamber of Commerce on a statewide basis. He will be coming to share information with us about the Tennessee legislature's actions in this session regarding LGBT equity and existence, as well as other topics related to that space. So we'll get an update on where we stand in Tennessee and Nashville on our civil rights for the LGBTQIA community. So join us June 2nd.
Hot Topics is always the first Friday of the month at noon. So if we get the number wrong, at least remember Friday at noon. Another thing that I tend to do from time to time. So if there are any last questions, we still have 4 minutes. And if not, I would like to say thank you very much to Dr. Sutton and Stewart. You are a great tag team. Just saying, great photos, absolutely fantastic. It's like you make Hot Topics look really great. Thank you. We have great, and I wanted to say one of the things. I believe that This Is Nashville had a little spiel about Fort Negley a while back. And I had many people who listened to that and said, oh, you've got to get someone to talk about Fort Negley. So this was a highly sought after topic, and you guys are fantastic, just great. So much.
I'm so glad that this came to fruition, Karen's. We were trying to figure out how to best, get Cyril and Dr. Sutton in on a noontime show. And I am just delighted. This has been fascinating. And really, the only thing as to even a Nashvilleian of over a decade and a half, my understanding of Fort Negley was really around the unhoused issue and all of the turmoil with that. And I had no idea about the significance outside of that, frankly. And I feel somewhat embarrassed to have that gap in my knowledge. But now this is just really amazing to know and to share. So we will do that.
Thank you.
And I would encourage everyone to go. I've seen so many people out there that said, I've never been here before. And I would encourage people to go to Fort Negley. It's easy to access, easy to get to, and go in and watch the video that's shown in the Visitor Center. There are great screens in the Visitor Center that show pictures that were taken during the Civil War of what the fortifications look like, and then walk up on top of the hill. It's a wonderful place, especially this time of year to be.
And the Tube Patrol is fantastic. They're really great.
Really.
Thank you very much, everyone. And
thanks,
join us again in June.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Melissa. You did good.
Yeah, this was great.
And Laura, thank you so much for putting up with us. I appreciate it.
No problem.